Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. Today, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture is going to be a standalone lecture, not to be part of any sort of series, such as the Anti-Fetos Papers, Rules of Civil Procedure, so on and so forth. This lecture is going to be dedicated to articulating a recent ex-post shared by the Calhoun School of Law. That being the official position of the Calhoun School of Law is that the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution must be repealed. Real quickly, what is the 19th Amendment? It is the one not necessarily guaranteeing the right to vote to women, but the prohibition, rather, of restricting voting on the basis of sex. I'm going to do my best to make this lecture as brief as I can, but also as thoroughly explained and elaborated as I possibly can, because this is a very, very sensitive topic. So it warrants both brevity, but also direct, very thoroughly studied information. And I guarantee to you, I have quite the sleuth of information. So let me go ahead and state these 5 specific reasons. This isn't a fully encompassing list. These are just the biggest, most direct points. First and foremost, the 19th Amendment infringes upon states' rights and state sovereignty, regardless if it's an amendment or not. Therefore, is equally as enforceable as the U.S. Constitution. It is completely contrary to the whole purpose, to the whole purview of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution wasn't created to facilitate the voting or the practices of an American citizen. The founding generation openly recognized that the U.S. Constitution doesn't form a country, a nation, or a state. It forms a union. It's an agreement between the states. The way the 19th Amendment violates the U.S. Constitution, despite it being an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, is it's contrary to the very crux that the U.S. Constitution is to be. That is, the U.S. Constitution, as stated in its preamble, is formed to secure the states of their sovereignty. It is for the states' benefit. And one of the powers retained by the states, both inherently and explicitly, is their right, is their authority to determine how their elections are going to be governed, who gets to participate, when, where, and how. And what the 19th Amendment, equally with the 15th Amendment, if I remember that correctly, it's the 13th, 14th, or 15th, jointly, not in conjunction with the other two, but in tandem with the 19th Amendment, violate the very purpose, the very foundational understanding of the U.S. Constitution, that, of course, being the Union serves to protect the state's sovereignty. If a state doesn't want certain individuals of a certain sex or a certain sex voting, the state has the authority to determine that. Same thing with race, same thing with culture, same thing with, let's say, IQ, let's say with hair color. Anything a state wants to do in terms of regulating or providing a criterion or criteria for voting is solely left to the state to decide. And if you don't like it, if you think it's racist and you think it's immoral, horrible, wicked, I'll give you the same answer that Thomas Jefferson would have given. I'll give you the same answer that virtually every founder would have given. You don't like it? Leave. Go to a different state. That was the whole point of maintaining the state's sovereignties and unique individual identities. If you didn't like how, well, we'll go back to the 13 states. If you didn't like how New Jersey was governing itself, then go to New York. If you didn't like how New York was doing it, go to Pennsylvania. If you didn't like how Pennsylvania was doing it, go to Delaware. That was the whole point. And if you think, oh, this state is so stupid because it doesn't let women vote, petition for the state to change, or go to a different state. The federal government, the union government, is not designed or designated the moral arbiter to determine what the states can and can't do. There is one section in the U.S. Constitution that says, here are the powers that the states are surrendering. Therefore, they can't practice them individually anymore. Everything else is left to the states. So that's the first and foremost argument, because it's not based on any sort of psychology. It's not based on any sort of personal biases or prejudices. It's a matter of fact and law. It's a matter of the construction of the U.S. Constitution. If you want to know why it doesn't work, that's why. It's going contrary to the purpose of the U.S. Constitution. The second reason, it is historically consistently the pattern to be true that effeminate leaders are bad. They're ineffective. They're self-deleterious. They cannot enact their duties properly. They can't do it correctly. And effeminate, if you'd like to look through the etymology dictionaries, if you'd like me to do a quick snippet, just a quick 1 minute, maybe even 30-second lecture demonstrating or showing effeminate in these different dictionaries of etymology. Effeminate means weak, means cowardly, means servile, submissive. Does this in any way mean that they are inferior or less human, these effeminate individuals? No, it doesn't bring into question their human value. It brings into question their human nature, their qualities, their inherent characteristics. And I think despite his manipulative tactics, they are politically and historically true, consistent, and reliably applicable and effective. Regardless how much I despise quoting his work, Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince, I think it was in chapter 19, said the way that you become a hated leader, that you are held contemptible, is by practicing effeminate traits. He says in chapter 19, I've got the quote pulled up here, I'll put it up on the screen. You'll be held in contempt, on the other hand, if you're seen as changeable, superficial, effeminate, fearful, or indecisive. That translation comes from Tim Parks. He's published, or this work was published by Penguin Classics. Again, that's chapter 19, titled Avoiding Contempt and Hatred. And the reason effeminate leaders don't work is because of that very explanation. If you are changeable, if you are mendable, if you are pushed by the winds of opinion, of public concern, you are going to lead to the destruction of your principles. That's just an inherent end. It may be unfortunate, it may be shameful, but that is an inherent end, and it's an innate characteristic of the female mind. Now, we've got another source that says actually it's not inherent of the female mind, and we are going to be reading through that together. But history, political science in general, governance throughout the ages shows to the contrary. Effeminate individuals, specifically women, have an inclination to be swayed, have an inclination to be influenced. When they take that position, when they are influenced, when they are swayed, they put the people that they are supposedly leading and governing in great danger. And allowing that sort of influence into the electorate, into the voting, into the ballot, or into the voting booth, that's what I meant to say, into the voting booth on the ballot via the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is a guaranteed, it's unfortunate, but it's a guaranteed, shown through history, political repetition to be either the beginning or the ultimate demonstration that your nation, your body politic, has failed or is going to fail. It sounds brutal. It sounds cruel, but it's a fact of history. It is a fact of reality, a fact of political science. And it's why Machiavelli, despite my disdain for quoting him, because his tactics in The Prince, they're true, they're effective, they work, but they're deceitful and they're manipulative. Despite that, what he articulates as being an ineffective leader, that being an effeminate leader, is true. It rings true. Number 3, all the way up to and including when the 19th Amendment was ratified, and I've studied into the 19th Amendment, its proposals, its drafts that were sent to the state legislatures. It was ratified legitimately as far as I've seen. If you have any evidence to the contrary, again, as always, I'm more than willing to admit that I'm wrong and to adopt the historical record. But up to and including the time that the 19th Amendment was being considered and ratified, there were significantly more anti-suffragettes than there were suffragettes. There were significantly more women saying no, they don't want the right to vote, than there were women who argued in favor of suffrage. The reasons for that, because of how early it was, aren't as easily compiled and listed. But the arguments made against the 19th Amendment are almost identical to the warnings that Miss Phyllis Schlafly was giving during the consideration of the Equal Rights Amendment. So number 4 is going to be Phyllis Schlafly's warnings about the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment did ultimately fail. It was very close, very similar to how the 19th Amendment was worded. Now, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, wasn't regarding necessarily voting directly and individually, but in more general terms, it was a piece of evidence, a demonstration of how the 19th Amendment had come to fruition in showing Machiavelli's warning, Machiavelli's recommendation not to have effeminate leaders, not to have effeminate individuals in government, executing political science and fulfilling political science. What Phyllis Schlafly warned about were a number of things, but specifically, she warned that there would be more overreach, that abortion would become federally subsidized, that homosexuality would rise exponentially, that women would be drafted, so on and so forth. And most of her predictions came true. Most of her predictions, despite the ERA, because of the avenue allotted by the 19th Amendment, came true. Now, why is homosexuality a bad sign? Again, this isn't personal bias. This isn't any sort of, oh, you're just Bible thumping. We know for a fact that homosexuality and acceptance, tolerance of sexual deviancy is a sign of a nation's downfall, of a body politic's self-destruction. We know that for a fact because of Dr. J.D. Unwin's work titled Sex and Culture. He did not like his findings because he wanted to prove the opposite. He wanted to demonstrate that, in fact, homosexual tolerance or tolerating sexual deviancy wasn't a bad thing, that it's required in a free culture. But instead, he found the opposite. He went and studied some 85 different cultures over a number of centuries, and he found that every single time that the culture became accepting to sexual deviancy, within 3 generations, it fell. The culture was wiped off the face of the earth. And he accounted for a slew of different factors, and was very, very well established in his study for isolating that singular quality, that singular aspect of tolerating sexual deviancy, and how that directly led to the downfall of all of these different cultures. So number 4, Phyllis Schlafly's warnings about the ERA. The ERA, though it failed, was a direct demonstration of the 19th Amendment playing into the effeminate corruption of leaders, which brought about the ERA. Ultimately, it failed, but has essentially implicitly imposed what the ERA meant to impose. And for this last point, before we go into really deep detail about these different arguments, about these different positions, it may seem specious, it may seem frivolous or facetious, but a very effective way to determine the interests, the adorations of a populace is by their arts, by their literature, by their music, by their paintings. So I went first, and to make sure no evidence was skewed, I checked both sides, male and female. I went to the arts, and I looked at the literature, best-selling literature for women and men. You can look at the top 10 best-selling books because it doesn't make a better case for either side. The best-selling book, according to multiple different sources for women, is a book titled The Fourth Wing. The best-selling book for males is titled The Anxious Generation. And just so you get a quick snippet of what these books are about, I went ahead and pulled up the description as listed on Amazon. So first we'll look to the male's book, just to see if there's any condemnatory aspect about this novel. So The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness, says this. Again, this is on Amazon, and it's written by Jonathan Haidt. This is the best-selling book, according to multiple different sources, the best-selling book for men. After more than a decade of stability or improvement, the mental health of adolescents plunged in the early 2010s. Rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide rose sharply, more than doubling on many measures. Why? The Anxious Generation, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, pronounced Haidt, not hate, Haidt, lays out the facts about the epidemic of teen mental illness that hit many countries at the same time. He then investigates the nature of childhood, including why children need play and independent exploration to mature into competent, thriving adults. Haidt shows how the, quote, play-based childhood began to decline in the 1980s and how it was finally wiped out by the arrival of the phone-based childhood in the early 2010s. He presents more than a dozen mechanisms by which this great rewiring of childhood has interfered with children's social and neurological development, covering everything from sleep deprivation to attention fragmentation, addiction, loneliness, social contagion, social comparison, and perfectionism. He explains why social media damages girls more than boys and why boys have been withdrawing from the real world into the virtual world with disastrous consequences for themselves, their families, and their societies. Most important, Haidt issues a clear call to action. He diagnoses the collective action problems that trap us and then proposes 4 simple rules that might set us free. He describes steps that parents, teachers, schools, tech companies, and governments can take to end the epidemic of mental illness and restore a more humane childhood. Haidt has spent his career speaking truth backed by data in the most difficult landscapes, communities polarized by politics and religion, campuses battling culture wars, and now the public health emergency faced by Gen Z. We cannot afford to ignore his findings about protecting our children and ourselves from the psychological damage of a phone-based life. That's the best-selling book for men, according to multiple different sources. How about the best-selling book for women? Again, according to multiple different sources. The book is titled Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I think that's how you pronounce the last name. Let's read the review just real quick. One of the reviews from the book list. Suspenseful, sexy, and with incredibly entertaining storytelling, the first in Yarros' Empyrean series will delight fans of romantic, adventure-filled fantasy. Now let's read the description. 20-year-old Violet Sorengale was supposed to enter the scribe quadrant, living a quiet life among books and history. Now the commanding general, also known as her toughest Talon's mother, has ordered Violet to join the hundreds of candidates striving to become the elite of Navarre, dragon riders. But when you're smaller than everyone else and your body is brittle, death is only a heartbeat away, because dragons don't bond to fragile humans. They incinerate them. With fewer dragons willing to bond than cadets, most would kill Violet to better their own chances of success. The rest would kill her just for being her mother's daughter, like Xaden Riorson, the most powerful and ruthless wing leader in the Riders Quadrant. She'll need every edge her wits can give her just to see the next sunrise. Yet, with every day that passes, the war outside grows more deadly, the kingdom's protective wards are failing, and the death toll continues to rise. Even worse, Violet begins to suspect leadership is hiding a terrible secret. Friends, enemies, lovers. Everyone at Basgiath War College has an agenda, because once you enter, there are only 2 ways out: graduate or die. The reason I said when you look at the top 10, so just to make sure we're not skewing, just to make sure we're not making a hasty generalization, just to make sure we're not cherry picking, I did go ahead and look at the top 10 best-selling for both male and female. The top 10 best-selling for female, if I remember correctly, were all but one or two fiction, fantasy. The exact opposite was true for the top 10 best-selling for men. And why is that important? It's important because when going about governing, like I said, a great way to tell the attitude, the character of a politic is through their arts, through their literature, through their paintings, their music, their movies now. The attitude, the characteristic, or the human nature of women, according to the arts, is fantasy, is fiction. And in this case, lewd fantasy and lewd fiction. Now, is that wicked? Is that evil? No, not necessarily. But it is unbecoming of those who are determining how anyone else can conduct their lives. These individuals who claim they ought to have a right to vote, which is not a right guaranteed to anyone. It cannot be guaranteed to anyone. It is a privilege. It is not a right. That's how it started. That's how it is understood, or was understood, and how it, by natural law, must be understood. It is a privilege. It is not a right. You do not get to determine how someone else lives their life directly or through a representative, lest you give some qualification as to why you should, why you ought to be able to. That was the whole argument made by the founders during the founding generation. The reason landowners only got to vote was because they had a stake in how the country turned out, a stake in how the union or their state turned out. Because if it turned out bad, guess what? Their land is gone. The reason it's important to look at the arts for these two populations, for these two demographics, is to obviate their attitude, the way that they are going to coordinate their ballot, how they are going to behave in the voting booth. And what you find, even if you choose the top 10, even if you pick from the top 10, is that females, women, are attracted to fantasy, are attracted to fiction. Males are attracted to nonfiction, or attracted to history, are attracted to wisdom and self-help books. Things that are physical, not imaginary. And again, none of that brings into question the value or the innate human value of man or woman. All it does is demonstrates human nature. And when we go about determining how we're going to govern others, including ourselves, like through voting, it's very important to know upon what the basis we will be voting. What is the foundation for the way we think? What are the reasons? What is the rudimentary beliefs that we hold, that we use to contrast or to judge policies which we will be voting upon on? And again, when we look at women, top 10 best-selling books, they prefer fiction. When we look at men, they prefer nonfiction. Which means when the voting booth comes around and is open, you will have one population applying actual reality, truth, wisdom, and principle, and you will have the other half of the population applying their fiction, applying their fantasies. And again, this, I will try to make this the last time. This does not bring into question the humanity or the innate value of man or woman. All it does is demonstrate exactly why this demographic who chooses fiction, non-reality, cannot be allowed to vote, cannot be allowed to determine how someone else gets to govern their lives, because they themselves aren't governing their own according to the terms of reality, according to the natural law. They are choosing to orient their perspective from a fiction, fantasy-based perspective. Again, do with that what you will. Don't go to the voting booth and demand that I or anyone else obey that same fiction or fantasy, because it's in direct discordance with natural law. So now, in order to contrast that, we're going to jump over to someone who can't be called a feminist because she was a vehement anti-feminist during her days, but very well-known, world-renowned author, Miss Ayn Rand. This is in The Voice of Reason, written and published by Ayn Rand. I think it's the Ayn Rand Library, in fact, or better yet. In chapter 26, she gives a synopsis on an essay she wrote for her magazine, which is The Objectivist, when she was posed with the question, what about a woman president? Why is this important to this topic? Voting, so it's presumed, is supposed to be as influential, as determinative of how the government's going to behave as the president. In fact, more so, because according to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, we the people, we the citizens, have ultimately the authority to determine how our government is going to behave. And if we don't like how the government's behaving, again, it's recognized by the founding generation that we have every amount of authority to reform or abolish it in any form or fashion we see expedient and to our direct benefit. So here in chapter 26, Miss Ayn Rand has a couple contradictions, has a couple distinctions from what I'm arguing here. She says, in fact, actually, women should be able to become congresswomen. Women should be able to vote, but not become president. Let's read what Miss Ayn Rand says, and then I'll juxtapose with her arguments how her position is, one, self-contradictory, but also is indicative of why the 19th Amendment can't be permitted, can't remain as part of the U.S. Constitution, and why the 13th, 14th, or 15th can't be included as well. So chapter 26, About a Woman President by Ayn Rand. This piece is an answer to letters from readers, was published in the issue of The Objectivist dated December 1968, although the piece was actually written in January 1969. About a year ago, in the issue of January 1968, McCall's published an article interview with 16 prominent women, myself included, myself being Ayn Rand, who had been asked to answer the question, what would I do if I were president of the United States? The first paragraph of my answer read, I would not want to be president and would not vote for a woman president. A woman cannot reasonably want to be a commander-in-chief. I prefer to answer the question by outlining what a rational man would do if he were president. She gave a really direct and concise answer when she was doing an interview, I think, on McDonough, when she was posed by one of the audience members about this question. You can still find the clip on YouTube. I recommend all of you to go watch that clip, because she basically just alludes to this, but gives a very abrupt answer. So she says this: thereafter, I received many letters from students of objectivism asking me the reasons of that particular paragraph. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with Ayn Rand, which I'm not sure how you could be, please don't take that as an insult. Ayn Rand, I guess, her novels are definitely on the longer side, but they're fairly dense of information. You might be familiar with her fiction work, Atlas Shrugged, yes, and then the 2 sequels to it. You might also be familiar with her more academic work, which is An Introduction into Epistemological Objectivism. That one, if you want to get your brain tied into a knot, but have your eyes open to a completely different world of thinking, I would definitely recommend it. She's on the level of Nietzsche when it comes to using 15-syllable words in that book, but it's a great read. Thereafter, I received many letters from students of objectivism asking me the reasons of that particular paragraph. So here we go. I was counting on the readers of my novels to understand my reasons. I grant you, however, that the issue is not self-evident and that it is not easy to conceptualize. For illustrative material, I suggest that you study the basic motivation of the heroines in my novels, particularly Dagny Taggart. I think she's the protagonist in Atlas Shrugged. If you're not familiar with Atlas Shrugged, you're probably familiar or at least seen a bumper sticker somewhere that has the question, who is John Galt? Who is John Galt comes from her books. I do not think that a rational woman can want to be president. Observe that I did not say she would be unable to do the job. I said that she could not want it. It is not a matter of her ability, but of her values. It is not an issue of feminine inferiority, intellectually or morally. Women are not inferior to men in inability or intelligence. Besides, it would not take much to do a better job than some of our recent presidents have done. Fair critique. It is certainly not an issue of the popular notion that women are motivated predominantly by their emotions rather than by reason, which is plain nonsense. We found that psychologically to be not true, that it's supposedly nonsense. We do find that in many different cultures, and psychologically speaking, there's a consistent reliability that females choose to rely on emotion rather than reason. And again, this doesn't in any way bring into question the human value of male or female, man or woman, simply the human nature of both. So unfortunately, Ms. Rand, it is not plain nonsense. It is not an issue of the false dichotomy of marriage versus career with the corollary notion that a woman's place is in the home. Whether married or single, women need and should have careers for the same reasons as men. Women may properly rise as high as their ability and ambition will carry them. In politics, they may reach the ranks of congresswomen, senators, judges, or any similar rank they choose. The reason that that is incorrect is because in the modern context, yes, that is true. Because as she's about to argue, those different positions don't hold as much authority as the president. According to the U.S. Constitution, they hold more authority than the president. The legislature, as the founding generation said, specifically Madison, said overtly that the Congress is supposed to have the most power. Why? Because the House of Representatives is directly elected by the citizens of the states, and the Senate is directly appointed by the states. Those two are the closest representatives, the closest delegates to the interests of the citizens and then to the interests of the states. The executive, merely to be the unifier when it comes to militaristic conflict, and also the chief diplomat. That way there aren't 500 congressmen flying north, south, east, and west to delegate treaties or to demonstrate diplomacy. And then James Madison said that the Supreme Court is supposed to be the least powerful because it doesn't hold the purse or the sword. It's merely supposed to be a guardian between the citizens and the government to make sure the government doesn't supersede the authority of the citizens. But when it comes to the post of president, do not look at the issue primarily from a somewhat altruistic or social viewpoint, i.e. don't ask, could she do the job and would it be good for the country? Conceivably she could and it would, but what would it do to her? The issue is primarily psychological. It involves a woman's fundamental view of life, of herself, and of her basic values. For a woman to a woman, the essence of femininity is hero worship, the desire to look up to man. To look up does not mean dependence, obedience, or anything implying inferiority. It means an intense kind of admiration. And admiration is an emotion that can be experienced only by a person of strong character and independent value judgments. A clinging vine type of woman is not an admirer, but an exploiter of men. Hero worship is a demanding virtue. A woman has to be worthy of it and of the hero she worships. Intellectually and morally, i.e., as a human being, she has to be his equal. Then the object of her worship is specifically his masculinity, not any human virtue she might lack. This does not mean that a feminine woman feels or projects hero worship for any and every individual man. As human beings, many of them may, in fact, be her inferiors. Again, notice that very important distinction. Not questioning the human value, but the human nature of each of the individuals. Her worship is an abstract emotion for the metaphysical concept of masculinity as such. which she experiences fully and concretely only for the man she loves, but which colors her attitude toward all men. This does not mean that there is a romantic or sexual intention in her attitude toward all men, quite the contrary. The higher her view of masculinity, the more severely demanding her standards. It means that she never loses the awareness of her own sexual identity and theirs. It means that a properly feminine woman does not treat men as if she were their pal, sister, mother, or their leader. Now consider the meaning of the presidency. Here's where Miss Rand shows her ignorance of the framing of the U.S. Constitution. The president, of course, has the power of the sword, but on the leash of the legislature. He is supposed to be on the leash of the legislature. And of course, the legislature is supposed to be the most powerful. Why? Because the Congress represents the citizens of the states, and the Senate represents the states. And all just powers of the government are derived from the consent of the governed. So the legislature very clearly, that's why it's in Article 1, first and foremost, has the most power. It controls the purse, it controls legislation, and of course, it has the sword at its heel, or it's supposed to. Ayn Rand doesn't believe so. She believes, let's see what she believes. Now consider the meaning of the presidency. In all his professional relationships within the entire sphere of his work, the president is the highest authority. No, he's not. He is the chief executive, the commander-in-chief. Even in a fully free country with an unbreached constitutional division of powers, unbreached is very generous to say, a president is the final authority who sets the terms, the goals, the policies of every job in the executive branch of the government. In the performance of his duties, a president does not deal with equals, but only with inferiors. Not inferiors as persons, but in respect to the hierarchy of their positions, their work, and their responsibilities. So important a distinction. Not inferiors as persons, not inferiors in human value, but in human nature, in their position of work. This, for a rational woman, would be an unbearable situation, and if she is not rational, she is unfit for the presidency or for any important position anyway. To act as the superior, the leader, virtually the ruler of all the men she deals with, would be an excruciating psychological torture. It would require a total depersonalization, an utter selflessness, and an incommunicable loneliness. She would have to suppress or repress every personal aspect of her own character and attitude. She could not be herself, i.e., a woman. She would have to function only as a mind, not as a person, i.e., as a thinker devoid of personal values, a dangerously artificial dichotomy which no one could sustain for long. By the nature of her duties and daily activities, she would become the most unfeminine, sexless, metaphysically inappropriate, and rationally revolting figure of all, a matriarch. I encourage all of you not to just read Chapter 26 of The Voice of Reason. I would encourage you to read all of it, as her insight, whether you read her fiction or her academic work, very valuable, very irreplicable. She was quite the intellect. But the way that plays directly into why the 19th Amendment must be deleted, why it has to go, why it has to be repealed, is because of those very reasons that Miss Rand was talking about. It's not to dehumanize. It's not to throw away or to bring into question the innate value of man, of woman, of mankind, of humanity. It is a recognition of human nature. That to provide this vote, I mean, first and foremost, it is an overt violation of state sovereignty. The states get to determine how, who, when, where, and for what its citizens will be voting. If you don't like that a state prohibits women from voting, go live in a different state, or petition the state to change. Don't ask the federal government, don't man worship the federal government and demand that they change it for you. Because that is the inverse, that is the contrary school of thought to what the U.S. Constitution was designed to be. That is the exact antithesis to what the founders had in mind whenever they were drafting the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution and the Union in general was formed for the benefit of the states, not vice versa. The Union is supposed to be at the heel of the states, not vice versa. So first and foremost, that is the argument against the 19th Amendment. Why the 19th Amendment must be repealed. It's nothing to do with personal biases. It's nothing to do with, oh, well, you're just a man who wants more power. It is a recognition of historical patterns. And as much as I despise quoting Niccolo Machiavelli because of his tactics, though applicable and effective, are manipulative and deceitful, he's right in saying that effeminate leaders, females, women, effeminate men, make for bad leaders. They are ineffective. They lead the people they govern into destruction, into danger, into the oblivion. And to provide, in a Republican government, in a supposedly free government, the right to vote, the access to determine how someone else is going to be governed, effectively making them leaders, those very people, you're begging. It's inevitable that your government, your nation, your body politic in general are going to crumble. Which is why, up to and until the 19th Amendment was ratified, even a little afterwards, a decade or so afterwards, there were significantly more anti-suffragettes than there were suffragettes. It is just a recognized pattern of history, a recognized truth of history, of political science, of governance, that matriarchs, effeminate leaders, effeminate voters lead to the destruction of the body politic, lead to the destruction of the government. And you can also take into consideration Ayn Rand's very unique arguments from an individual personal perspective. It's going to be very destructive to the woman, very destructive to her nature. Try to take up such a position, to have that much stress and authority on her shoulders. It's not in her nature to deal with it. And not last and foremost, those two are contradictory. Last but not least, a very reliable way to determine the attitude or the character of a politic is by looking at its art. Look to its literature, look to its paintings, its songs, and now movies, its film, and see exactly what is being personified in these displays of the mien, of the zeitgeist. And when we do that, when we look at the books, the top selling books for men and women, again, you can look at the top 10. It doesn't make a better case for either side. When you look at the top 10 best-selling books for men and women, you find that women are attracted to fiction and fantasy, lewd fiction and lewd fantasy, and men are attracted to nonfiction. Whenever you go to the voting booth, whenever the ballot is placed before you, do you want someone who lives in fantasy, delusion, and non-reality, voting on how you get to govern your own life? Or do you want someone who is more attracted to reality, nonfiction, truth, pragmatism, playing a significant part in determining how you get to govern your daily affairs? Take a pick, because you can't have both. When you have both vying for power, you're going to get what we have today, which is chaos, confusion, and disarray. So if you have any questions, I know for a fact there's going to be disagreements. Heated, hopefully cool, but definitely heated. Go ahead and post them down in the comments, because the whole purpose of the Calhoun School of Law isn't to wear one jersey or a different jersey. Its sole purpose is to provide you with the necessary skills and information to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. Equally, if you have a topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and include that as well. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law, to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, definitely typing out those heated replies, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'm not sure what the topic for the next lecture is going to be, but I'll do my best to make it as informative and entertaining as this one, if not more so. Regardless of the topic of the next lecture, until I see y'all then, I bid you all farewell. So this is postscript to the Repeal the 19th Amendment lecture. I wanted to clarify the reason and how it pertains, or the reason it was recorded and how it pertains to the Calhoun School of Law's ultimate goal of equipping you with, of course, those necessary skills and information to combat lawfare. Lawfare is conducted under bad government. Bad government is facilitated, solicited, and created on bad policy, on the ill wills or the inabilities of the governed. One of those inabilities, one of those recent demonstrations of bad governance, per se, was the ratification, was even the consideration of the 19th Amendment. And that goes for the, I think it's the 13th was the supposed abolition of slavery. I think it was the 15th that gave the right to vote, regardless of race. Lawfare, as said earlier, is conducted under bad governments, wicked governments. It's facilitated by wicked and bad governments. And repealing the 19th Amendment, understanding why it must be repealed, of course, plays to correcting what is currently bad government. That's how it pertains to the Calhoun School of Law's ultimate objective. And it shows definitely a devotion towards tenatur veritas, being bound to truth, because this topic, sensitive, inflammatory, definitely hysterical, must be discussed regardless in order to, 1, be rid of lawfare, and 2, assert that ultimate end of abolishing lawfare, that being restoring good government. So, as I said in the previous clip, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, I'm sure you do, go ahead and post them. I'm excited to read through them. And as I said in the previous clip, regardless of the topic of the next lecture, until I see y'all then, I bid you all farewell.